It's a huge privilege for me to come to speak to you here. You know, when I was a civil rights worker in Mississippi, a voting rights worker, the same kinds of people who were picketing out here in front this evening, shot at us. We were going around to help people go in and register to vote. And the KKK followed us immediately after we left a house and would threaten the people who were there. And one night, I never forget it, fortunately I was in a back room, they literally shot into the house, wounded a couple of my friends. So I know who the KKK are, and they are one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in this country's history. And I am glad to know that finally Robert F. Kennedy ordered J. Edgar Hoover, who was himself a racist, to infiltrate the KKK and finally bring them to their knees. This is the heritage also of this county, because you also have fought the battle, and you fought it here at the local level, and you also have won. And so it is a huge honor for me to be here with you. I want to tell you a little aside, by the way, about Henry Brewster Stanton and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were married, you know, he was her husband. He was a very successful attorney, and so was therefore able to, you know, support her various efforts at sort of really shaking up the entire establishment of the United States with the idea of women voting. But I will tell you this, that at the Seneca Falls Convention, when she first suggested that women should have the right to vote, this is 1848, a year in which women did not have the right to vote anywhere in the world, he thought this idea was so radical and so impossible that he actually walked out of the convention. So it does help you keep things into perspective, that even somebody as progressive as Henry Brewster Stanton thought that was really just a bit much. I want to talk to you today about genocide. It's a subject that first came to my attention when I was in Cambodia in 1980. Church World Service and Care had asked me to go in and set up the relief program in Cambodia shortly after the Khmer Rouge had been overthrown. And at first I really hesitated to go. My wife and I wanted to start a family and so forth, and we just didn't think that was a very good place to start a family. And then I made the mistake of telling them, after first saying no and getting, please get someone else, and they did send someone else, and that person burned out after about 6 weeks. They came back to me and asked me, and I made the mistake to say that I would pray about it. Well, now I don't see burning bushes or hear voices or anything like this, but it was pretty clear to me what I should do after that. And I went around to some of my professors at Yale Law School and talked to them about it, and they said, some of them, of course, said, well, you know, there's still Khmer Rouge running all over that country. You might not come back. That was really encouraging, of course. But I went to Jack Getman, who was my labor law teacher, and he was a Reformed Jew, and he said to me, Greg, he said, you don't have any choice. You've been called. That is a very old term. That goes way, way back in Hebrew history, as you know. And I knew he was right, so I did go. And I thought, well, I'll help hand out rice and, you know, maybe get the country a little bit back on its feet, because it was certainly on its knees at that time. What I did not know is that I would meet the survivors of one of the world's worst genocides, a genocide that took fully a fifth of the population of that country in just 3 years, in which at least 2 million people were murdered by the Khmer Rouge under their utopian Maoist communist ideology. And what came clear to me, having walked through the mass graves and talked to the survivors, was that the real call that I had received was to spend the rest of my life working against genocide. And so that's what I've done. 170 million people have been murdered by governments in the 20th century, mostly by their own governments. That is more than the deaths in all of the wars combined. And you know what? Until 1948, it was all perfectly legal. There was no international law against genocide. But finally, in 1948, the United Nations, led by Raphael Lemkin, gave this crime a name. Genos, which means a race or a people, and cide, to kill, genocide. He knew it needed a new name because this was entirely different than any other kind of crime, where Hitler tried to wipe out an entire ethnic group, an entire culture, an entire race of people, a religious group of people. Now, it's not a new crime, however. It dates back to the beginning of history. In fact, one of the earliest Egyptian monuments has a pharaoh claiming that he had wiped out the people of Israel. One could say he was just a little premature in that judgment. And our own country, as Tony has reminded us, was in fact founded on a genocidal ideology, the ideology of manifest destiny. And the Native Americans and the people in the Middle Passage during the slave trade were the victims of that genocide that we ourselves, our ancestors, committed. So when we talk about this subject, we shouldn't be just pointing the finger at somebody else. We should be realizing this is a human problem and that we are also part of that problem, and we have to think about it that way. But since 1948, at least, it has been against international law. Before then, the state could murder its own people without any violation of law. And yet, since 1948, there have been at least 50 genocides. And because there had been no international criminal court, and national courts in genocidal societies are not likely to try to prosecute their own leaders, there were also no prosecutions for genocide. I remember taking international criminal law at Yale Law School in the early 1980s from Professor Damaska, and we had the Nuremberg Tribunal, and we had the Geneva Conventions, and then that was it. It ended there. And I said, well, what happened after that? He said, well, very little, because we don't have any courts. And I said, well, what are we going to do about that? And he said, you have to go out and build them. So, of course, that's exactly what I've done. Not just me. A lot of people, thousands of people have built those courts. But it has, in fact, been the cause of my life. Until 1994, there was also no professional association to study genocide. In that year, we founded the International Association of Genocide Scholars. And until 1999, and this just absolutely was amazing to me, when I left the State Department, after we voted against the International Criminal Court, I always tell my students, never take a job you're not willing to resign from. until then, there was not a single organization in the world that was dedicated solely to the battle against genocide and understanding this problem of genocide. And so I founded Genocide Watch and the International Campaign to End Genocide, which now is called the International Alliance to End Genocide. And we have 50 members now in 11 countries, and soon we'll have probably twice that many. We're about to link up with an organization in Europe that has also developed an alliance of the same kind. So we are, in fact, a growing movement. It's a movement. We realized finally you couldn't just count on governments to try to solve this problem that was bigger than governments. So I'd like to take you through some of the basic principles that we've learned about genocide. Since we've founded these organizations and so forth, we've begun to understand some of the forces that in fact cause genocide. And the process, that's the most important thing to understand, because if you understand the process, it also allows you to take preventive action along the way to stop it. Because at each stage of the process, you can take steps to stop it. So let me take you through the basic stages of genocide that are caused by the kind of ethnocentrism and other problems that we have in the world and have always had. So I'm going to show you now a presentation that I'm going to ask the people who are doing our audiovisuals to put up now on our screen. This is our logo, by the way, for Genocide Watch. We used, of course, the most famous picture ever taken, one most useful pictures ever made, to remind us that we are really all are in one world. And you know the big mistake people make about race, the big mistake the Aryan nations made about race, is to think that there's more than one. There's only one race, the human race. And I can tell you as an anthropologist, I mean, genetically, that is absolutely true. So what we're going to do is now take a look at the process. And first of all, I want to introduce to you what Genocide Watch exists to do: to predict, prevent, stop, and punish genocide, to raise awareness and influence public policy, to build an international movement. So what do we do? How do we accomplish these objectives? Well, we work on education. That's why your education center here is so important. On prediction, we have a systematic, daily, literally daily, updating of a website to predict problems that are cropping up around the world, and we make sure that our policymakers hear from us about these problems. And we also work to develop institutions to prevent genocide. And I don't mean just military intervention. I mean prevention beginning with education, because that is where I think, and we'll talk more about this, we really have to do most of our prevention. We have, of course, supported interventions. We were very much involved in the East Timor intervention, the Cote d'Ivoire intervention, the Ivory Coast intervention. Some of our members in our coalition, in fact, were directly involved in those campaigns, including ours. And Macedonia, I've spent time in Macedonia working on that one, and several other interventions where genocide was actually prevented or stopped. And of course, justice. We've been directly involved in the establishment of the Rwandan Tribunal, the East Timor Tribunal, and now the Cambodian tribunal, to put these people on trial who have committed these crimes. This is a chart that we put out every year showing with colors where genocide is most likely to occur, essentially grading the danger level of genocide in a number of countries. Here you can see, we saw last year that in Eastern Congo, Sudan, in Sudan and in Somalia and in some of the other countries that we considered most risky, we rated them as having already current massacres. And then the next stage, the sixth stage, is potential massacres, where we saw that there was real potential for this kind of crime being committed in places like Equatorial Guinea, the Central African Republic, which, by the way, we've now moved up because we think that the coup that just occurred there a few weeks ago makes that a country much more at risk. And it's, in fact, shut down the hunt for Joseph Kony. We had U.S. Marines out there training the Ugandan army to hunt him down. This is a guy who goes around and cuts off people's arms and who forces girls into sex slavery and turns children into killers of their own parents and so forth. And we had a major U.S. policy to support hunting him down. And now, because of what's happened in the Central African Republic, that whole effort has had to be suspended. So that chart is something that we use, and our policymakers are very interested in it. We always make sure that they get it. Here is a map of the world that shows in colors how we rate these different countries. You can see the red countries, the most dangerous countries, the ones that are at stage 7 where there are current massacres going on. Some people think, everything's getting better in Burma. Well, a lot of them don't know about the Rohingya, which is a Muslim minority, 700,000 people who are literally denied all citizenship rights in Burma and are, in many ways not considered to have rights at all in that country. And in Kachin State in the far north, the same kinds of things are going on, and yet, despite the progress, those are places that we are concerned about. So what we do then is we apply a model that I developed in 1996 in the State Department. After the Rwandan genocide and having gone around and talked to a lot of diplomats, I realized that a lot of them didn't know what genocide is in the first place. But secondly, very few knew what the process was, how you could see it coming. Because genocide is not something that's, just an accident. It actually can be predicted if you can understand the process. And I'm not talking here about a linear model. I'm talking about a logical model so that you can actually get your mind around what the process is. So I'm going to go through that in brief with you tonight so that you can understand what I concluded the process was, having looked at a lot of genocides. The first stage in genocide is classification. You cannot have a genocide if you don't have classifications. Unless you can divide up the population in some way or another, there is no basis on which you can distinguish people. In fact, if you can defeat genocide at this level by refusing to classify, you have defeated it, period. The classification, as you know, in Rwanda was Hutus and Tutsis. And it was an us versus them classification. the way the Holocaust began was that Hitler actually took away German citizenship from Jewish citizens. Before that, Jews in Germany considered themselves Germans. So what he did was he reclassified the population. And by taking away their citizenship, effectively rendered them without rights. Native Americans were in exactly the same position in this country until the 1924 American Indian Citizenship Act. No citizenship in your own country. You were the first ones to be here. It's absolutely astonishing to think that we didn't allow Native Americans to vote in our elections. That was a good example of classification. Now, what do you do to prevent classification? Well, you develop universal institutions that can transcend the divisions. In Rwanda, for instance, right now, their big effort since the genocide has been to re-educate the population to believe that they're first of all and mainly Rwandans. And of course also human beings. That's my favorite one of all, as you might imagine. When I was a Fulbright professor in Swaziland, I used to cross into South Africa, it was still under apartheid, to work with the anti-apartheid movement, the United Democratic Front. And every time I have to cross, I'd have to fill out a form in South Africa, and it had on the form race. So I would just write human. Well, you can imagine what the Afrikaner border guards thought about that. They kind of scowled at me and they'd cross it out, and they'd say, they write in white, and I'd say, no, it's really not. If you take a look, it's kind of pink, really. But, this is the thing. If we can develop these universal institutions, and there's a lot of ways to do this, besides, for instance, nationality. Think of all the languages we speak. If we can find universal languages to speak, sports, music, all kinds of ways in which we can communicate, science and so forth, these are universal languages. These are ways to overcome these classifications. The second stage is symbolization. You can't even talk about classifications unless you symbolize them. And that's because we are symbol-using animals. That is the way our minds work. It's what's amazing about human minds and human beings. We have a potential for intelligence that no other creature has because of this amazing ability. Classifications are symbolized and groups are given names and other symbols. This is a good example. This is one of the ID cards from Rwanda. This man was a victim, a Tutsi, and this ID card was found near a mass grave in Rwanda. And you can see right on it that he was classified as a Tutsi. They had crossed out Hutu and Twa, that's the pygmy group, and naturalized and left it as Tutsi. I knew this was going to be dangerous in Rwanda long before the genocide. In 1988 and 1989, I had lived in Rwanda. And I had a dinner one night with the chief judge of the Supreme Court of Rwanda. And I said, these ID cards are going to be used for genocide someday. And he said, they already have been. He said during 1959 to 62 massacres, they used the ID cards. And I said, well, can't you in the Supreme Court declare these things unconstitutional or something? And he said, no, we don't have judicial review here. You're going to have to go to the president. So I did. I got a, audience with the president, and he was very cordial and so forth, and thanked me for the work I was doing on trying to make the judicial system work better there and so forth. But then we got down to the ID cards, and I said, Mr. President, these ID cards have got to be changed. You got to get that ethnic identification off of those ID cards because otherwise they'll be used for genocide. And it was as though an ice mask had gone down over his face. He did not want to hear this. And it turned out, of course, President Habyarimana, had himself led some of the massacres against Tutsis in the past. So, but if you can do away with the symbolization in some way, you have beaten the genocide again. If you can make them illegal, fine. That's a great one. I mean, for instance, you can't even put up a swastika in Germany now, or in Austria. They've been through Nazism. They know what it means. It is literally illegal to put one on a wall. You'll be arrested for it. But even if you can't do that, if you can just render the symbol utterly meaningless, it is equally effective. When the Germans tried to impose the yellow star in some of the countries in Europe, Denmark, the king was famous for having said, if you try to use it in Denmark, I will be the first one to wear one. In Bulgaria, the president and the head of the national church refused to distribute them. In other words, only 3% of Bulgarian Jews died during the Holocaust. And that was only because the Germans eventually took over directly. So if you can render hate symbols meaningless, you have defeated them. That's exactly what happened in Bulgaria. And of course, in Denmark, they actually smuggled all their Jews over across the channel to Sweden, and so they didn't lose any. Dehumanization, though, is where the real problem lies. Dehumanization is where one group denies the humanity of the other group. The reason it's so important is because every social group has rules against murder. And if you can convince yourself that whoever it is that you're killing is not human, then of course it's not murder. The way you do this is to use hate propaganda in printed media or on radios. I'll give you an example. Rwanda. Rwanda, of course, was a country in which a small elite actually planned and carried out a genocide that killed 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus while the world stood by and watched. Worse yet, the world actually withdrew UN troops that were already there that could have, if they had been reinforced, stopped a lot of the killing. Tutsis were referred to by the national radio as cockroaches. This is a broadcast on Radio Télévision Libre de Mille Collines. It's reenacted in a movie called Sometimes in April. The preventive measures that you need to do is you have to condemn the use of hate speech and make it culturally unacceptable. Organization is the next stage. This is the stage at which the hate groups organize, in which the SS or the Aryan Nations or the KKK or whatever group is planning to carry out the killings organizes. It's usually organized with the help of the state, using trained and armed militias. Rwanda witnessed the organization of extremist militias such as the Interahamwe. And here they are. What do you do to prevent? You outlaw membership in the groups. That's what our RICO statutes have done against the mafia and against some of the drug gangs in LA and so forth, very effectively. You deny leaders visas for foreign travel. You impose arms embargoes. You create commissions to investigate violations, so forth. The fifth stage, polarization. The groups are driven apart through propaganda and laws. The Nuremberg Law is the most famous example of this, where it was literally illegal for Jews to marry pure Germans or Aryans. Moderate members I'm sorry, are we off of that? Yeah, okay. Moderate members of the perpetrator's own group are arrested and killed. The way you deal with this is you seize the assets of the extremists and you impose diplomatic sanctions. Here is a cartoon in a Rwandan newspaper after the shooting down of the plane of the President Habyarimana. And here they say, get up, go to work, sharpen your tools, lift your truncheons. We have to eradicate this breed of cockroaches. Finally, you have preparation. Just before the genocide, in which you arm, the victims are identified and singled out, death lists are drawn up, symbols are forced upon the members of the victim group, you segregate them, you drive them into ghettos, and what can you do about this? Well, first of all, the international community needs to raise hell about it, but you also need to outlaw this kind of thing. Segregation has to be outlawed. The prevention of this at this point is to declare a genocide alert and to actually have major diplomatic sanctions or even direct intervention. Extermination is the genocide, where actual massacres take place. Often there's cooperation between the nation's armed forces and militias. And in my opinion, and this is where, even though I'm a great advocate of nonviolent resistance in most cases to overthrow regimes, and you'll see an example of this, your only real option, if you have a genocide underway, is rapid and overwhelming armed international intervention. I don't think UN intervention is very likely in most cases because the UN is such a flawed institution because of the Perm 5 veto. But regional organizations have effectively intervened in a number of cases. ECOWAS in West Africa, in the Ivory Coast, in Sierra Leone, and in Liberia finally, and we had intervention by ASEAN in East Timor, and there have been other such regional interventions. NATO, of course, is a powerful intervener if you can get it to intervene. If you can get the intervention to occur, the people who have been committing the genocide will often flee. This is a pile of machetes left behind by people who have fled. These were the people who committed the genocide in Rwanda, and they fled into Zaire, which is now called the Congo. The final stage of genocide is always denial. The perpetrators deny that there was any genocide. And they may do so for many, many years. The Turks are still denying that there was any genocide against the Armenians. This is 90-some years later. It's astonishing. I've written personally, when I was president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, I wrote many letters to the Prime Minister of Turkey saying, you know, really, you didn't do this. It wasn't your crime. Why don't you just face up to the history of your country, and just as we should in the United States, and say this happened and it was terrible, and now move on. And of course, that is still what I think that the Turks should do. But there is another way to deal with denial, and that is prosecution, in which you actually do bring the perpetrators to justice. You prove the facts of what happened, and that is why I think setting up tribunals and so forth is so important. This is the headquarters of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And this is a wanted poster that was issued by the U.S. government, in fact, to give $5 million rewards for the capture of many of the people who were accused by the Rwandan tribunal. Did we learn from Rwanda? Not much. Darfur began in 2003. There were attacks by rebels in Darfur against the Sudanese government's Air Force in an air base in Al Fashir. And so what did the Sudanese government do? It armed Janjaweed militias. These are Arab militias. At the time of the beginning of this, there were 6 million people in Darfur. And the UN estimated that now 300,000 of those people have died since the start of the conflict in 2003. Most of those people are still in internally displaced persons camps or refugee camps. Very few have ever been allowed to go home. 2 rebel groups started the attack, and then what the Sudanese government did was conduct a policy of what has been called by Milosevic, who invented this term, ethnic cleansing. It's a term I hate because actually it is forced displacement, starvation, murder, torture, and rape. All of those are crimes against humanity. These are some children in one of the displaced persons camps. And it has forced hundreds of thousands of people, mostly farmers and villages, from these non-Arab groups to flee their homes. And despite the government's denial of its involvement in crimes in Darfur, in March 2009, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Sudan's president, making him the first sitting head of state ever to be indicted by the International Criminal Court. We were involved in that, by the way. You don't have to be in favor of the International Criminal Court for the UN to refer a case to the International Criminal Court, and that's what they did in this case. It was under the Bush administration that was done. And a friend of mine from Yale Law School, we used to sit in the back of federal procedure class, pass notes back and forth to each other. And but anyway, he was, rock rib Reagan Republican, and I called him up and I said, Nick, this is Nick Rostow. I said, I think you can probably draft a UN resolution that would make this a resolution that would allow the UN to refer this case to the International Criminal Court, but not place U.S. citizens and other citizens of countries that are not parties to the International Criminal Court under any danger of ever being indicted. And that's exactly what he did. So in other words, there are ways to do this if you're a smart lawyer. So what's happened? Well, nothing. Bashir continues his reign in Sudan, has extended the genocide now to the Nuba Mountains and to the Blue Nile area of Sudan. More thousands of people are being killed. And I have to tell you, we just held a conference in George Mason University to talk about this problem. And we're very, very disappointed at what has happened. Basically, nothing. Our country is still content to be a bystander, to send in humanitarian aid, but not to do anything else. It's one of the main lessons in Samantha Power's famous book, A Problem from Hell, is that has been the traditional U.S. response to genocide. It's easy to understand, actually. My son was a U.S. Marine, a scout sniper, in fact. And I'm very proud of him. He was a very good U.S. Marine. But it is very painful and hard for us to send our own flesh and blood into combat in countries where genocide is occurring. We have lost 4,000 men in Iraq, and men and women in Iraq, and now more in Afghanistan. So we cannot be the policemen of the world. We've got to figure out better ways to intervene if we have to intervene militarily. And that's why I am so much in favor of using regional organizations whenever we can. Well, let me tell you about two other cases, because I want to tell you about some cases in which it didn't come down to intervention by military means. My view is that the best place to prevent genocide, in fact, is long before it happens. So let me tell you about what happened in Ukraine in 1991, when I was legal advisor to the independence movement in Ukraine. And I'm talking here about how to free a Soviet prisoner and free a nation. The first rule, go to where there is the injustice. Make the leaders know the world is watching.
If the authorities know that the world is watching and that you are there because you are the eyes and the ears for the world, that will be a considerable help to the people who are under attack.
The second rule, when I first got there, this is because I was chair of the American Bar Association's Human Rights Committee. They asked me to come in, and so they said, Professor Sten, what should we do? I said, well, Dr. King always taught us to personalize the injustice. Make sure that they know that it is a person who is being attacked here. You focus on the leader who's been imprisoned. In this case, Stepan Kamara, a member of parliament, one of the independence leaders who had been elected. This is under Glasnost. It's under the loosening up of the Soviet system by Gorbachev, had been elected to parliament, and the KGB actually had the gall to arrest him on the floor of parliament. Big mistake. So I said, first we get the leaders of parliament to go to the prison where we will demand to see Stepan Kamara, and we will go also with his priest, Father Lassif, and take along fellow members of parliament to demand to see him.
Ameryki, profesor międzynarodowego prawa, został przeznaczony jednej po powodu chmary.
The deputies of the Soviet priest and International America would like to meet with the warden concerning the cases.
That's Father Lassif there on the right. So we asked to meet with the warden, but he told us we couldn't see Kamara. Big surprise. So then what you did was you go and mobilize the people. You hold a mass rally, and you choose to hold it in the central square, the middle of Kiev, the biggest possible place where you can hold it, where there's a huge, maybe 100-foot high granite statue of Vladimir Lenin looking down over you, the symbol of the oppression. And then at that rally, you announced that from that day forward, you will march daily. Many people will march daily to the prison to demand to see the prisoner. And so that's exactly what we did.
We are here today to lay the foundations of a new republic, a new nation in the family of nations, a new Ukraine. Yet we are also here to commemorate the lives of those who have already laid the cornerstone, those whose blood has soaked this rich Ukrainian soil, those who have prepared this ground with their hands and watered it with their tears. And we are here today to honor those who suffer today for freedom. Among them, Stepan Kamara, Mykola Holovash, Leonid Berezensky, Oleksiy Kovalchuk, Ole Batovkin, and Mikhailo Ratushny. We are here today to sing a new song of liberty in this land, to proclaim a new poetry of personal freedom in this former prison camp of tyranny. Yet the song we sing and the poetry we proclaim is as old as the human heart and as eternal as the human soul. It is the song my American ancestors sang when they broke free from colonial bondage and declared their independence from the empire that enslaved them. It is the poetry that Thomas Jefferson proclaimed in our American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, that they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Out of this winter of discontent will be born a springtime of liberty. From the melting snow of tyranny will spring up the flower of freedom. And the warm summer wind will scatter its seed across the Ukraine. And the Ukraine will again be green with life. Yes, the Ukraine will again be free. Free Stepan Kamara. Free the Ukraine.
Now, I've cut out the translations there because there was a regular translation just to shorten this. But so they were with me all the way on that speech. And of course, what was amazing about it to me was that these words were just as revolutionary to them as they were in 1776. Well, we were being blocked, of course, by the legal authorities here from even going to see the person that we wanted to get out of prison. So we decided to simply go straight to the prosecutor of the Ukraine. So we walked into the building where his office is, marched up the stairs with TV cameras rolling. There was, by this time, an independent TV station in Ukraine. And we then confronted him. And we asked that we be able to see this prisoner. And I will now show you what happened.
So we are now going to go to the Ministry of the Interior and again to the Procurator's office for one last
He was very surprised.
I can tell him that because I need to be able to see him.
I want you to look at this gesture.
Please excuse, I don't intend any rush. So, yeah, too close the door. Oh.
I think that's what's called giving you the finger with two fingers.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. The procurator informed me that we would not be permitted to see Stepan Kamara. He also informed me that I possibly could be arrested for having stood in front of the rally yesterday and read the American Declaration of Independence, that this was not a legally sanctioned rally. In fact, he told me that the only political rallies that are allowed in the Soviet Union are those that are allowed by the authorities, that is, for which permission has been granted by the authorities. I told him that I hoped that the Soviet Union's laws and the Ukraine's laws would someday become consistent, that is, they would become in accord with international law, that the right of public assembly is a right guaranteed by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 21, that the right to counsel is guaranteed by Article 14 of that covenant, to which Ukraine and the Soviet Union are both bound. He said to me that, of course, these covenants don't have any legal status until they're enacted into law in the Ukraine. I said to him that it is nevertheless the case that if a nation does violate these international laws, that the nation's own laws may in fact be in violation of international law, and that I hoped that a day would come when the Ukraine's laws and the laws of the Soviet Union would be in accord with international law.
If you are turned back, you simply say you'll return. You'll return for the trial, and you remind the listeners of your long-term goals, freedom of the prisoners and of the nation.
I told him that I will be hopefully present when, if Stephen Kamara
And
is
I was,
tried.
by the way, there.
And
they dismissed the charges against
it
Kamara.
remains to be seen just what will be done in this case. The results are that I've been able to carry out the investigation of the case and am completely convinced now that this is a political trial.
Результати є, що я зуміг вивчити цілковито цю справу, і я є тепер цілковито переконаний, що це є політичний процес.
The fact that the authorities won't even let me go and meet with Stephen Kamara is to me further evidence of the political nature of this trial.
Що власті не дозволяють під жодним оглядом мені зустрітися з Степаном Хмарою, є ще один поважний доказ, що це є політичний процес.
But our efforts are not going to end here. There will be lawyers, congressmen, senators, parliamentarians from all over the world who will be focusing on this case because the liberties of all of us are threatened when the liberty of one of us is taken away.
І отже, наші старання тут з цим не закінчаться. Конгресмени, сенатори, адвокати, парламентаристи по цілому світі будуть підносити їхні голоси в обороні Степана Хмари, бо коли одна людина неправильно не є ув'язнена, то грозить і нам всім.
Yesterday, just now, up here in the procurator's office, the procurator told me that I could be arrested for having participated in the rally yesterday in the center of Kiev.
Ось зараз, при нашій зустрічі з прокурором Шевченком, він попередив мене, що я можу бути арештований за участь в несанкціонованім мітингу вчора.
He said that the only meetings that are allowed in the Soviet Union are those that are permitted by the authorities.
Він сказав, що одинокі мітинги, котрі дозволяються в Радянському Союзі, є ті, котрі влада дозволяє.
And that I could serve 5 years for having stood up in front of that rally yesterday.
І за те, що я виступив перед мітингом вчора, то він сказав, що можуть засудити мене на 5 років.
I told him that I would gladly suffer any penalty for having the right to read to these people the American Declaration of Independence.
А я йому відповів, що я є готовий на любе мучеництво за право зачитати Декларацію незалежності Америки перед українським народом.
To feel the thrill from their hearts when that was read, to hear them cheer as they heard those ancient words, those words of Thomas Jefferson, filled my heart, and I will never forget that time, and I will never forget this visit.
І їх захоплення українського народу, як вони слухали зачитання Американської декларації незалежності, їхнє захоплення сердечне наповнювало і моє серце, і мою душу з великим хвилюванням. І я ніколи той момент не забуду, і я ніколи мою подорож на Україну не забуду.
And I will never forget the Ukraine and the people of the Ukraine. I will never forget the freedom of the Ukraine.
І я ніколи не забуду Україну, я ніколи не забуду український народ, і я ніколи не забуду волю Україні.
Ми дуже вам вдячні, але що ви хочете напослідок сказати нашим глядачам?
What would you care to say in conclusion to our viewers?
I shall return.
Я повернусь.
Ми дуже вдячні. Ми дякуємо.
But not all heroes, and I was not a hero there. I was just one of many people who fought for the liberty of Ukraine and for the breakup of the Soviet Union. Not all heroes are in other places. We have heroes right here in Kootenai County, and I want to remember them and I want to celebrate them because many of them are sitting with us here today in this room tonight. I want to remember the defeat of the Aryan nations by this very group. The Aryan nations, an American Nazi movement led by Richard Butler. Dehumanization, these are the stages, remember. Openly racist, propaganda, print and internet, white supremacist, dehumanized other racists.
It soon became clear that this was no normal house of worship.
I tell you this, kindred, that the alien is now flooding in. They are displacing the people of Los Angeles, San Diego. They're displacing the people out of Chicago and out of New York.
In Christian identity theology, Jews are children of the devil. They will eventually join with non-whites who are considered subhuman and wage a war against white Aryans. To prepare for the battle and strengthen Aryan numbers, Butler promoted separatism, including a territorial imperative. 5 Northwest states, including Idaho, would be for whites only.
For as the alien comes in, there is nothing more that the white Aryan can do but obey the commandment of Yahweh his God and separate himself.
So they were organized. They built their Hayden Lake compound. They held their weekly church, quote, church services. They organized armed militias. They tried to polarize the community through cross burnings, through murder threats. The response, very, very intelligent, was to outlaw the hate crimes right here, to get a law passed against felony malicious harassment, a unique law that should be made law all the way across the United States. It's the perfect balance between the right to free speech and also against harassment that is malicious and felonious, like it was in this case. And it was invented right here.
Free again, in the land that we choose, free forever, is the will of God. Hail victory! Hail victory!
Participants left the compound ready to do business.
You're like, let me find somebody. Let me find a guy holding another guy's hand. Let me find, an interracial couple, and I'll teach them what this world's supposed to be like.
Years before TJ visited the compound, community members realized that Butler's hate speech was translating into hate acts. First, a Jewish restaurant owner, Sid Rosen, had his business spray painted with Nazi graffiti.
Well, I think they're very serious. Butler's been in this type of thing for many, many years, and I think that he's deadly serious.
Then Keith Gilbert, a former member of the Aryan Nations, repeatedly threatened a family with biracial children.
Keith Gilbert was saying, if your family doesn't get out of town, we're going to kill them. That was a direct, serious threat.
Tony Stewart, a former college professor, was among a group of 8 concerned citizens who met in 1981 in the basement of the First Christian Church in Coeur d'Alene to form a support group for the victims. Attorney Norm Gissel also joined.
These victims could not feel isolated. They needed to be reminded that they were part of our culture and that they were not the human other.
Keith Gilbert was found guilty of a misdemeanor, verbal assault, the only law the prosecutor could use. But the group, now known as the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, felt the crime deserved harsher penalties. Assisted by people around the state like Gail Spicer, president of a Boise synagogue, members pushed for a new law, felony malicious harassment. At first, lawmakers were skeptical.
You could tell some of them thought that this was just, not necessary at all.
What may have ultimately convinced legislators to pass the bill were supremacists who came to testify against it, including Richard Butler in his Aryan Nations uniform.
You could just see a visible change in their attitude, just a real awakening that these people have got to be dealt with.
The bill passed in 1983. With it, some of the urgency of the Kootenai County Task Force passed as well. Several members moved away, and the group asked Bill Wasmuth, a priest at St. Pius Church in Coeur d'Alene, to be its chairman.
The response? Education. That's why Genocide Watch's major focus in the next how many years, I don't know how many years it will take, is going to be education.
The task force was undaunted. It would keep speaking out.
If we learned anything about the history of Germany and Hitler, when he started out with less than a dozen people, they made the fatal error of not taking him serious at first. So we would never remain silent. We never have.
Not everyone supported the decision.
There was a real split in the community. There were those who said, by addressing this, we are just inflaming the media and getting more attention on something that we just want to go away.
If you are quiet around Nazis, you lose and they win.
So members would hold educational events, and they'd regularly travel to communities where hate was springing up.
And so when Christian identity theology promotes the superiority of one race over another, we have to call it for what it is, racist and supremacist.
This meeting was organized by residents of Sandpoint, Idaho, after they heard some of Butler's supporters wanted to establish a white homeland there.
And people like Marshall Men reminded everyone that polarization and hate are bad for business.
Task force members weren't afraid to respond.
I'm not a hater. I don't have time to hate. You guys hate enough for all of us. So.
One of the members most disliked by the supremacists was Marshall Ment, a Jewish realtor.
The FBI come to my house a couple of times, told me I was on a hit list, told me to check my car, look behind, look in front, look on the sides, look underneath.
It never deterred him.
I never lost sleep over the Aryan Nations, ever.
One of Men's main concerns was the huge hit that North Idaho's economy was taking because of its reputation.
We lost hundreds of millions of dollars from economic development just because of the people who wouldn't consider moving their businesses here because of the image that I do.
So there we had the preparation. The hate crimes had already begun. And the prosecution.
What Stewart could not know was that an even greater victory was in the works, even as the Aryans marched. 2 weeks before the parade, Victoria and Jason Keenan stopped near the compound to pick something up they dropped from their car. When they drove away, they were followed by 2 guards from the Aryan Nations.
Then I heard a gun going off, boom. And then another gun went off, another shot, boom, and another one, boom.
5 times the shots hit their car until it skidded off the road. Then the Aryans assaulted the Keenans. The perpetrators fled only when another car came down the road. When sheriff's deputies arrived, they told the Keenans to go on home. And the next day, one of the deputies simply told the Aryans to stop harassing people.
They got away with it. It wasn't going to be pursued. And there was boasting and bragging about it.
Eventually, Victoria sought out the task force.
If the task force had not been in existence, the Keenans would have had no entity to report this terrible event to.
The guards were finally indicted. They pled guilty and were sentenced to prison. But Stewart and others knew this was the case they'd been waiting for, a direct connection between a crime and Richard Butler.
And I called Norm, I said, this is a smoking gun in my opinion, and Norm said, I think so.
To try and punish Butler, they'd have to go to civil court. Gissel called Morris Dees of the Southern Poverty Law Center, a lawyer with a track record of breaking hate groups by bankrupting them in civil lawsuits. He agreed to take the case along with local attorney Ken Howard. After a week-long trial, the jury returned a verdict, a total of $6.3 million in damages. Butler had assets of only about $225,000.
And the difference between $225,000 and $6 million is functionally a political and cultural statement of how angry that jury was that they did these things to the Keenans, and by a larger extension, what these people had done to North Idaho.
We intend to take every single asset from the Aryan nations now and forever, and hopefully close that sad chapter in this history of this nation.
I guess all I can say is, justice has prevailed, and yes, we have won.
But Butler would soon file for bankruptcy and abandon the compound. 6 months after the verdict, some of the human rights advocates who had worked so hard to counter the Aryan nations would walk on the compound for the first time. Gissel had already been in the buildings to remove material for preservation, but there were still stacks and stacks of the literature left, along with other depictions of hate.
The book that made the Jews so mad they had to invent the movie Holocaust. God.
The voices are still here to me. I have to convince myself that I'm walking around that I'm not going to run into somebody.
For the alien has
They sat here and heard Butler rail against me.
This is the war.
He publicly from this pulpit preached against the task force, and he preached against me by name as the head of the task force. And that triggered the people sitting out there in the pews, justified their coming after me with that pipe bomb that night. And that's the importance of that verdict, is that that kind of violence is not going to be triggered from this pulpit anymore.
And after you've won, you make people remember. You build memorials, you destroy the compound, you build the Kootenai County Human Rights Center, you build the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise.
Wasmith lived long enough to see a milestone, the destruction of the compound. The Keenans had won the property at a bankruptcy auction. Then Greg Carr, an Idaho philanthropist, bought from them. After talking with the task force, he decided to destroy the buildings.
It's just a really unpleasant memory and an unpleasant symbol, and I think we wanted to just get rid of it.
Today, the land is quiet, home only to animals like this horse.
Symbolically, it is changed from very dark and evil to, I think, it's a special place.
Some wanted the compound to be turned into a human rights center, but it's far from town and has no water. So Carr donated $1 million for a human rights center in Coeur d'Alene and another $1 million for a human rights center and memorial to Anne Frank in Boise.
We declare the Idaho Anne Frank Human Rights Memorial open.
They tarnished Idaho's image for nearly 30 years.
You're scum! You're scum of the earth!
And left a stain that's hard to remove.
2, 4, 6, 8. We don't want your racist name.
But despite the dangers,
About 11:45 last night, a bomb went off outside my back door.
a small group of human rights activists spoke up.
We would never remain silent. We never have.
You've got to live human rights. You can't just say human rights.
And they won.
We saw the beginning, and the middle, and the absolute end of an American Nazi movement.
But what's still below the surface?
If we think that just because we knocked out the top of the iceberg and that bias is no longer in Idaho, we're dead wrong.
He pointed his finger at me and he said, "Look at the terrorists."
I was bullied so much that I even had to try to take my own life.
Still, there is light.
I just want to say how heartening it is for me to see this.
It doesn't take a special kind of heroic effort to combat bigotry. You don't have to be a superstar, you just have to speak out.
To be given the honor of leading a purposeful life is a precious thing.
And I leave you with that.